Hello, William here again, and thank you for joining me. Now, I'm an avid reader of Woodturning magazine, and on the cover of the winter issue was a rather fetching yew pot or a bowl with a copper bound rim. Now, the author of this project, Les Symonds, explained the process how he achieved this in great detail over 5 pages. So I thought I would like to have a go at something similar, except maybe use some wood other than yew, and also add some patina to the copper banding. So in my log pile I have this piece of Laburnum, which is quite old and wormy and was only given to me quite recently, and it does exhibit a very deep crack, which makes it more suitable for this project. Now, there's about 9 inches by 6 inches of potential useful wood in this, hopefully if I can get it trued up to those sizes. Also to hand I have this roll of I think it's 0.8 of a mil copper wire, which should be sufficient to do the banded rim around the top. So once I have this roughly turned, I will have an understanding of what the final size of wood I've got to play with, and then I can do a sketch to match as close as I can to Les's article. Now I'm going to give my spindle roughing gouge a quick sharpen before I move over to the lathe. Now, a trick I learned somewhere along the line was to use a Sharpie to colour the face of the chisel before you start to sharpen it. This allows you to check that you've completed the sharpening process consistently. Now, this is a very dusty and wormy piece of wood, so I'm going to don my 3M VersaFlow respirator system to keep the dust out of my lungs. Okay, now I've found the centre at both ends and got the log mounted between centres. It will run at about 530 RPM without too much vibration. Of course, I can increase the speed once the log becomes more balanced. Okay, with the dust extraction system running, I can start roughing out the piece, but with frequent checks on the tailstock to make sure the log isn't becoming loose. Keeping my tools sharp on this project will optimistically reduce the chance of a catch on that large crack. As you can see, there's a lot of dust coming off this particular piece of wood. The dust extraction system and the VersaFlow seem to be taking care of it okay. Okay, we can now mount the piece in the Colossus jaws and true it up again. Okay, just to make sure it's still running true, I'm just going to trim it up with the spindle roughing gouge. Okay, having done that, I just need to check the length and the diameter of the piece to see what wood I've got to play with. Okay, the length of useful wood I've ended up with is about 200 mm long and 170 mm in diameter. Having got those dimensions, I can now make a sketch of the piece, giving the appropriate dimensions. Now, this cracked and wormed piece of Laburnum is ideal for this task, but I'm going to have to take some precautions when I'm hollowing it out. So I can just reduce the end to the intended diameter of the top before I profile the outside. Now, since my sketch I produced is life size, I can actually use it to transpose the dimensions onto the piece. So having marked out the boundaries of the beading and the banding, I can now delineate these using the parting tool. So having got the position of the banding and the beading sorted out, I can reduce the outside profile of the base of the piece. Now, whilst sharp tools and reasonable high speeds can mitigate the chances of a catch on this crack, there is also the possibility of the piece disintegrating, which I also need to address. So the first thing to do then is to drop copious quantities of thin CA glue down into the crack and give it some time to cure. Now, to do the beading, I'm going to use an improvised tool which was described by Mike Waldt in one of his videos, which is in fact an adapted spindle gouge. So here I'm just marking out the recess where the copper wire is going to be seated. Now I can just shape the beading with this improvised tool. I'm not that bothered about the quality of the finish, since there are already some pieces missing from the beading and I want it to look rustic anyway. Okay, before I start excavation, I'm just going to drill a pilot hole using a 35mm Forstner bit down to the base of the pot. And due to the depth of the cut, I needed to change over and use the Forstner extension bit. Now, as I'm excavating this piece and the walls become thinner, I consider that the risk of the piece disintegrating increases. To mitigate this risk, I've hijacked one of my hose clamps from my dust extraction system and clamped it around the outside. I'm also going to cover the clamp in yellow tape to make it more visible while it's revolving, to reduce risk to my knuckles. Now, I should be deploying one of my primary weapon systems, which is the Simon Hope Easy Arm Hollowing Jig, to excavate this pot. Now, the excavation will be done in two phases, primarily with that marvellous little 6mm cutter, which will remove most of this material in just a few minutes, followed up by the 19mm scraper to give it a nice finish. Now, once I've got it reasonably smooth inside, time to do a bit of abrasive work, and as you'll see, I tried various techniques, but in the end, doing it by hand with some sandpaper wrapped round a stick produced the best result. Now, considering this is a rustic piece, I didn't dwell too much on the inside of the pot. Once I did get there, however, I just cleaned out the dust with the airline and finished it off with a single coat of Danish oil. So now turning my attention back to the outside of the pot, just going down the grits now to 400. So the finish on the outside of the pot then is a single coat of diluted sanding sealer and one coat of Danish oil. So moving on now to the copper wire banding then, I've started off by drilling a 1mm hole near the crack, in which I've anchored the wire with some epoxy resin. Now I've improvised a clamp to hold the wire in place should I need to let go of it during the winding process so it doesn't unravel. I'm going to apply a small amount of epoxy resin around the band where the wire is going to be wound round, just to try and hold it in place a bit better. Now I gave the resin 5 or 10 minutes to start curing and make it a bit sticky before I started to wind the wire on. Okay, with each revolution of the pot I used a lollipop stick to actually push the wire together to keep it nice and tight. Now winding the wire on proved to be not so much as a challenge as I thought it would be, and it seems to be going on okay. Now once I'd completely filled the gap with the copper wire, I tied it off on the tool rest to keep it taut while the epoxy resin set. Okay, having given the 30-minute epoxy resin a couple of hours to cure, all I have to do now is to drill a small hole and cement in the other end of the wire. Now before I add the patina activator, I'm just going to clean off the surface of the copper wire with a piece of wire wool. So having added copious quantities of the activator, I'm going to leave it overnight and have a look to see what it looks like in the morning. So in the cold light of the morning, I can't say I'm particularly impressed by the results of the patina. To me, it's not a natural result and looks too artificial. So in order to improve the patina, I'm going to rub it back a bit with wire wool and add some blue activating agent. So while the activating agent is magically working its stuff, I hope, I just parted off the piece off camera and finished off the base with some sanding sealer and Danish oil. Okay, so there we have it, the finished article. A piece of a very old wormy and cracked laburnum with a copper wire banding around the top. Now, if I attempted something like this again, which I may well do, I would change a couple of things. First of all, I would make a parallel-sided pot because I think it's more in keeping with the effect that I'm after. And also, I wouldn't use copper wire. I would use a copper band around the top, nailed in, and some patina added afterwards. My personal opinion is I think it would look better than this. Now, I look forward to next week's project. Now, back in early September last year at Yandel Show, my good friend and very accomplished woodturner Rob Hall from way up there in the north of Somerset gave me a piece of timber. And we're still kind of trying to decide what it is, but I think it's a boxwood of some sort. It is extremely dense and very heavy, but very old. Now, at the moment, I don't have a clue what I'm going to do with this, but obviously I do want to make my best effort because it was a gift. And I'll have to think over the next few hours or day or so actually what I'm going to do with it. I know what we can do with this. We can cut it in half and do something. Whoa, right? Whoa, no.